When I decided to run for office as a first-time candidate in 2018, I wanted to run a different type of campaign that really centered on lifting up new voices, being a mentor, and building a pipeline of leaders, reminding people that elections do matter, because there absolutely is a lot of apathy out there, but there's also again, that feeling of distrust where my vote doesn't matter, so why bother? You have to inspire them. You have to rebuild that trust and give folks a space to learn and grow, to understand why their voice does matter.
Coming to you live from the swamp, the Gilmore Show. Okay, the tie is straight. Everything's straight. I look good. Damn, I look good. This is an important day. Big interview. Ha ha. A great gator-sized greetings to all of you. Today's guest is Florida Representative Anna V. Eskamani, a bold and unapologetic fighter for Florida families and everyday people, proudly representing House District 42. Representative Eskamani, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's get started right away. Could you explain the difference between the state legislature and the federal legislature, and what kinds of things get decided there, and why it's so damn important to pay attention to what happens at a state and local level?
Oh, absolutely. I think there has been a nationalization of our politics, especially through the media, where most folks don't even realize they have a state representative or a state senator. It's almost like we jump from your local government to federal, and that there's just no recognition of what's in the middle. And that means that a lot of people don't vote in these state elections. And so things happen in your life and your community that are directly decided by the legislature at that state level. So much like your federal system of government, we have three branches at the state level. We have the executive branch as the governor's office, we have the judiciary, our state court system, and of course we have legislature. And this is the branch that not only crafts the budget each year that funds every program in Florida, from health and human services to public education to the Department of Corrections, DCF. I mean, you name it, the state of Florida is funding it to some degree, including transportation projects. And so on a funding lens, not only does the state of Florida collect taxes, but then the state legislature allocates those dollars to different programs and different needs. And very important to be a part of that process. Our state budget right now is $117 billion with a B. And that is your money being allocated by state officials to different subcategories. The other component is the policy piece. So we're actively working on policy during legislative session that impacts your daily life, whether it is going to be the bills that get a lot more attention, like those that restrict access to abortion or LGBTQ plus rights, or different bills that impact property insurance crisis, other economic issues. There's also smaller bills that maybe don't get a lot of attention, but still have a direct impact on our families with disabilities, on folks who are looking towards job training programs and wanting to scale up their skills, to programs impacting every state agency, from Department of Children and Families to DOC. There's so many bills that impact the criminal legal system that move through. It's important because these are issues that impact your daily life, including environmental protection and gun safety. And so I would say the biggest difference between the federal and the state is that state is a lot more closer to you. And I would argue you have a better ability to affect state government than federal. There's not a lot of bills that actually pass Congress, but out of the legislature, there are hundreds of bills that get passed. And so it's so important to be part of that process.
Thank you. How would you describe your approach to building political power? How does change happen? What does that look like?
Oh, for sure. I mean, my theory of change really falls heavily on collaborative governance. So I'm a firm believer in breaking the silos between individual stakeholders, but also in bridging the gap between grass tops and grassroots. So I came up into this process very much as just an everyday person wanting to have a positive change in my community. I wasn't happy with my representative at a state level, and I was also working at Planned Parenthood, so I was already civically minded and engaged in advocating for individual freedoms and access to healthcare. And so with that as my foundation, in addition to growing up in Orlando as a daughter of working class immigrants, I really wanted to ensure that we had representation that reflected who we are and what our needs are. And so to keep myself honest, I really try to keep a close connection to my community. I'm active in a lot of different spaces. I'm knocking on doors. I'm trying to do what I can to be my biggest critic while also giving space for more critics and to process that feedback and to try to make people feel proud, because the reality is that there's a lot of distrust in politics, and rightfully so. I feel like it is my duty to try to break through the stereotype of what a politician is and restore hope and humanity in public service as an act and as a responsibility in society. So collaborative governance also means that we are constantly facilitating an inside and outside strategy. So yes, I'm definitely, a part of the legislature. So to some degree, I'm in the system, right? So I really tried to dismantle that system and to bring everyday voices inside to not only ensure that they have influence in impacting laws and impacting lawmakers, but and also gleaning ideas. Again, I never want to assume what a community actually needs. So I look towards community to tell me what they need and then to help carve a path forward, whether that is through policymaking or rulemaking or something as basic as constituent services. And so that has always been my theory of change. I believe that power is the culmination of organized resources, organized people, and organized ideas. And it's up to those of us who have the ability to be facilitators to bring those forces together. And I also facilitate a lot of trainings. I'm not someone who holds on to power. I don't believe in positional power being the end all be all. I believe in collective power, and all boats will rise together if we're willing to teach and mentor. And so I really do my best to try to be that facilitator and create space for others to also shine.
Speaking of those trainings, one of those organizations that does those is People Power for Florida. Could you talk a bit about this organization?
Oh yes, this is one of my babies. So I was really frustrated by just the lack of voter registration and just the disappointment of the Democratic Party as a whole, and not working and listening to young people and young leaders. And as someone who kind of grew up in that organizing space, I mentioned part of my background, but I went to the University of Central Florida, and that's kind of where I got more involved in civics and helping to connect people to their government. And I did that through the College Democrats at UCF. And I just remember engaging with different politicians, some who inspired me, but others who also kind of made me feel less so. That made me feel like I was just free labor, not a leader. And I never wanted to create that feeling for others. And so when I decided to run for office as a first-time candidate in 2018, I wanted to run a different type of campaign that really centered on lifting up new voices, being a mentor, and building a pipeline of leaders. So I saw that we were able to do that through our local work in Central Florida. But how do we amplify that statewide while also, of course, prioritizing efforts like voter registration, vote by mail renewal, and reminding people that elections do matter, because there absolutely is a lot of apathy out there, but there's also again that feeling of distrust where my vote doesn't matter, so why bother? And you can't just lecture people out of that mentality. You have to inspire them. You have to rebuild that trust. You have to empathize with that feeling and give folks a space to learn and grow, to understand why their voice does matter. And in fact, I spoke to a group of philosophy students at Valencia College earlier in the week, and this was the discussion we had. And we had it from a very philosophical perspective, but also a practical lens of thinking, my voice doesn't matter, but when I can help inspire others to also participate, it has an impact. And I just felt like, aha, yes, like these young leaders are getting it, right? But if I wasn't there to help facilitate that conversation, we probably never would have had that conversation. And so People Out for Florida is committed to creating those spaces, to creating those, not just dialogue, but practical skills. So we've hosted a series of youth organizing boot camps across the Sunshine State. We've actually hosted 7, from Central Florida to North Florida to South Florida to Tampa. And they've been phenomenal. We've trained nearly 300 young leaders on the basics and foundations of community organizing, how to craft a campaign plan, how to be a better communicator, how to tell their personal story for social change. And we're building an alumni network out of that as well. And so that has been just such a rewarding experience for us, but it comes with a cost, of course. We're raising funds to lead this work. It's not something that I get a salary from. You know, my responsibility is to raise the funds, but I don't get any of the funds. It goes straight to the staff, and we don't take any corporate money. So it's very much like a grassroots operation, and we run a lean but awesome team. And actually, this year already, we registered from January to March. We've registered more than 1,000 students to vote, and just in April, we've registered more than 200. Our goal is 400. So these might sound like modest goals, but they are very difficult, especially in an environment where a lot of young people do feel disenchanted by politics. So we just do the labor, we do the work. We love our partnerships. We work with a lot of different organizations, and voter registration in Florida has become even more difficult. So we have a lot of groups who don't do voter registration anymore. And I actually testified in court as a witness against the latest voter suppression bill, Senate Bill 7050. That trial just ended. And I was in the witness stand speaking to the legislative process of how this bill was fast-tracked, but also its discriminatory impact and how it's led to many organizations just not doing voter registration anymore. So we have often been the group that kind of holds the liability for others because there's just a lot of risk involved in this work, which tells me, by the way, that if the legislature is trying to take away voter registration, that means it's freaking important. We have to keep doing it. So I'm proud to do this work, but it is definitely challenging, and I'm grateful for the team that leads the charge.
Right on. I think anyone who has done any voter registration would know those are not modest numbers.
I know. I mean, my God, it's like rejection hell, but it's so important. It's so important.
You mentioned your time at Planned Parenthood and fighting for reproductive rights, access to abortion. This has been a through line over the years in your work. Unfortunately, there's a coordinated effort across the U.S. to deny people these fundamental human rights. Could you talk a bit about the national context and also the upcoming ballot initiative in Florida?
Oh yeah, I love to. So I really just fell in love with the reproductive freedom movement as someone who was directly impacted. So I mentioned growing up in Orlando. My mom passed away when I was 13 years old, and it's a very difficult experience. And my sister and I, my brother, we're all to some degree her caregivers as well. So just experiencing that loss was huge for us. But of course, made more complicated by the fact that for my sister and I, we were still growing. You know, our bodies were changing. We're at that time where you start experiencing menstruation, and we just didn't have a parent to talk to about it. So I really relied on my public school for information. And at the time, we had absence-only education, which was not really education, was incredibly disempowering and filled with misinformation. So that motivated me to try to find my own support. And so I walked into a Planned Parenthood health center when I was 18 years old, and I left with a method of contraception that was right for me. And I felt so affirmed in that space. And as I held this little pill pack in my hand, I felt a deep sense of gratitude that I would be able to decide my destiny, my future, my family. But I also felt this gravity of the moment because I realized how many young people would never have this sense of gratitude, would never have this sense of control. And that was just something I could not accept. So I noticed when I was at Planned Parenthood, there was a little volunteer and donate sign. So I was like, I can get more involved. So I remember making maybe a $10 donation one day when I was checking out, you know, because I go once a month to pick up my pills. And so I remember like making a donation, and the front desk was like so surprised by it. But I was like, yeah, I just want to help you guys. Like, thanks for being there for me. And then when I was at UCF, I realized that there was a student chapter. Back then it was called Generation X, and now it was called Vox, Voices of Generation X, and now it's called Generation Action, which like makes me feel so old, right? But Vox was a group on campus that did amazing work and bringing the stigma around sex ed, and we would host an annual event called Let's Talk About Sex Baby. We raised funds and support for Planned Parenthood, and I just got really involved in all these spaces, all these advocacy spaces, started volunteering at Planned Parenthood, was eventually hired there. And I worked there for 6 years, becoming the senior director of public affairs and communications across 22 counties. At the age of 26, 27, I was managing a team of 6, over 11 health centers and 40,000 patients. And I just loved the work. I mean, I felt like it was, something really impactful. And I became this unapologetic abortion out loud advocate, working in the legislature, not ever as a full-time lobbyist. I was never a full-time lobbyist, but I would travel a lot to Tallahassee, bringing patients with me to tell their stories, and just day by day, year by year, being incredibly disappointed by the legislature and taking away our rights, making life harder for our patients. And so fast forward to when I decided to run for office in 2018, this has always been a motivating factor for me. And I take a lot of pride in the fact that every person who voted for me knew I worked at Planned Parenthood, were just as supportive of reproductive rights as I was. And it really became a rallying cry for a lot of us as we saw what took place with the fall of Roe. And today, instead of being on the defense, we're going on the offense. And we have the Yes on 4 ballot initiative being led by a coalition called Floridians Protecting Freedom. And our goal is to codify reproductive rights here in the Sunshine State to ensure that every person, regardless of how much money they have or where they live, can make the decision about their families, can decide whether or not to parent, can choose adoption, or choose to end that pregnancy without political interference. And so this is a very important campaign. We are striving to break stigma around abortion, to have these important conversations, and to really amplify 2 key points. One is that when you find yourself in a situation of either an unplanned pregnancy or a pregnancy is no longer viable, or perhaps a pregnancy that may hurt you and lead to a risk of your life, that no one cares what your party affiliation is. It is a healthcare decision. And with that said, we've seen, and this is my second point, that Republicans overwhelmingly agree, and that 35% of those who signed a petition to get abortion on the ballot are registered Republicans in Florida. So I am incredibly hopeful that we will reach the 60% threshold, but it is going to require all of us to have conversations we maybe never thought we would have with our families about this issue. And of course, it requires ensuring that the electorate is ready to vote, which is why the work of voter registration is so critical.
That last statement is an excellent jumping off point. I'd like to talk a bit about bipartisanship. In Florida, where there is a Republican supermajority, if you're going to get anything done legislatively, you're going to have to work with Republicans. But also, you don't want to send a message to the communities targeted by those clowns that you're all buddy-buddy with the worst people on the planet. How do you balance these 2 competing aims?
It's a really great question. And I'm glad as a Gator, you know what clowns are and you have such a good grasp of what clowns are, because that's like the perfect term. So it is definitely a challenge. For me, it is all about leading with grit and grace. I also try really hard to compartmentalize on different issues. It is difficult, but to your point, there are moments where we are aggressively opposing legislation, and then the next bill is one that we all support. I also, of course, work across the aisle to pass bills. One of the bills I'm most proudest of is our permanent tax break on children's diapers and adult incontinence products, which took us 5 years to work on, and it would never have passed if I didn't have buy-in from Republicans. So I think it's important to look at your colleagues as coworkers versus friends. So I think that's key. I am not someone who goes out. I don't go to evening events. Like I'm very much in my office all the time. So I try to really maintain that level of professionalism. There are going to be Republicans that I know I just can never work with. I mean, they're just incredibly toxic and bombastic to the point where other Republicans don't work with them either. So it's not even unique to me per se. But then there's going to be most folks that candidly, they do not align with the direction of the party, but they don't have the courage to do anything about it. And so those are folks that sometimes I can win over. And I think it's important to acknowledge when you have those wins. So for example, on the abortion ban, 7 Republicans voted no. And, I went up to all 7 of them and said, thank you for voting no, because I do realize that in their caucus, it's incredibly, not only is it unusual, but it's punitive when you go against your caucus. And so I want to acknowledge that and, kind of recognize, the decision that they made. And that helps me maintain a lot of respect. The last point I'll make is this respect piece. So when I'm on the House floor or in committee, I am not there to embarrass or shame you. I am there to ask tough questions. So you do that to yourself. Like, it's not my job to do that. But if I ask you tough questions, you will embarrass and you will shame yourself. And that's not my problem. And so I really do find my role to not be one that perpetuates harm to anyone, but I'm going to highlight the harm that your bill is causing. I'm going to ask tough questions where you expose that yourself. And my hope is that I'm laying a foundation for litigation. And that's why, I mentioned that I was a witness on one of these bills. And so I do think it's important to use your position, not just in the legislature, but outside the legislature, and use your bully pulpit as much as you can. So, a lot of people know me as one of DeSantis's biggest critics, and I'm damn proud of that. And I think it's important to not lose sight, of why you're here. And it's important to celebrate your wins, but don't let your wins outshine the harm that the legislature is causing. So I also don't get distracted by that. I do not co-sign bad bills. I mean, one of the examples is the social media ban. Many Democrats voted for that bill. I refused to, and I wasn't going to be a co-sponsor. I mean, many Democrats were co-sponsors of that bill. So I also try to stand out as a strong Democrat that also offers an effective contrast to the Republican agenda. And I'm not going to feel peer pressure to vote for bad bills. I mean, one example, and honestly, this is something that has taken, it doesn't come natural. You really have to also build your sense of confidence and resilience in this process, because it is hard. You're gaslit all the time. You feel pressure from your colleagues to get along, to go along, right? And so I often find myself sometimes being the only no vote on bills, or maybe one of 2 no votes, one of 3 no votes, or opposite, like on the ceasefire resolution where I was one of 2 yes votes. But I do think it's important to not lose sight of who you are. And even if you're not going to win that fight, it's a fight that's worth having.
Not a big fan of old DeSantis myself. Ron, you corrupt piece of shit. You ain't worthy of a swamp. I'd tell you to go to hell, but you don't do so well with the heat. With the challenges we're all facing right now in this world of ours, I'm really interested in the concept of hope and different approaches to resiliency as you do the work of going up against the most powerful people and organizations trying to ruin the world. How do you maintain hopefulness in the face of it all? What keeps you going?
Well, I have a little sticker on my laptop that has a Millennium Falcon with a rainbow behind it, and it says, "There are more of us." And so I'm constantly looking at that as a reminder, especially when I'm in the legislature where I am outnumbered, that in the greater public, I am not, that I am a part of the majority that is rational, the majority that does want to take care of one another, the majority that believes diversity is a strength, not something to be scared of. And so I do find a lot of comfort in not getting trapped in the ivory tower of the legislature, which is one reason why, by the way, I come home every weekend. I rarely stay in Tallahassee. The second I can leave is I get out of there. And it's very restorative, but also kind of reminds me of who I am and where I come from. So I don't get trapped in that Tallahassee lobby, environment, that very I'm fancy environment. I try to get out of there, right, as much as I can. I also find a lot of hope, though, in just our history. One reason why conservatives are trying to erase history is that they know the hope and strength we find in our history. And almost every social movement, it was generations of effort. So the pendulum right now has dramatically swung to the extreme. And we are so uncomfortably close to fascist government. I mean, it's just so scary where we are right now. But when we work together and stay focused and think about our history, we have been through terrible moments before. We will survive more terrible moments in the future. And this pendulum is going to swing back. And the question is, how far do we want it to swing? Where do we want it to land? And I want it to land far beyond we ever imagined, right? To build a world where every person has opportunity to endless joy, to be themselves and to have success. And so the vision, that proactive vision that I have in my heart and my mind is really what keeps me going. And I do, of course, think about my own personal history and my family who sacrificed so much for me to be here, who came from Iran into a country where they did not speak the language, where they didn't have any money. And, you know, how courageous my mom was in her fight against cancer. I mean, I think about what I would do if I was diagnosed with cancer, which is something I think about too much, honestly. But like everything she went through, like multiple surgeries, all these treatments, like that was so brave of her. And I don't feel like I ever give her enough credit for how hard she fought just to survive. And when I think about what she went through, it's like, okay, yeah, I can do this. Like I can handle this. You know, there are people that are going through so much more than I ever will. And like I am blessed to have a bed to sleep at night and food on the table, right? And so I don't have room to complain. And I'm in a position where I can do more, so I have to do more.
All right. We talked about the past. Now we look to the future. You have now reached your term limits for the Florida House, and, well, you aren't planning on retiring from politics just yet, are you?
I mean, I feel like nobody would blame me if I did, because it is hard. But no, I mean, I'm 33 right now. I feel like I'm just beginning this work of service. I'm getting my PhD right now as well. So I hope to finish my PhD this summer and be able to walk that stage and get that chapter closed. So I am thinking more and more about what is that next chapter for me. And there's a lot of well-meaning folks who have a lot of different ideas. But I am thinking more and more about potentially running for mayor of Orlando in 2027, as we're going to have the first open mayor's race in 25 years. And our mayor has done a phenomenal job in leading Orlando through so many challenges and triumphs. And so I think we would really benefit from new perspective to Orlando's next chapter. And so as someone who is homegrown in this community and has served with honor for what will be 8 years, I'm really thrilled with the opportunity to maybe take this to a different level. And of course, inspire more people to want to get civically engaged at a hyper local level. And local governments can solve so many of our problems, so many of our social ills with the right leadership and creative perspectives and ideas. So that's what I'm kind of processing. And of course, I need to be focused on 2024 right now because I do have an election, but I'm reflecting and having great conversations and really thinking about that, you know, what that would look like if we made that leap to local government.
Well, well, well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Representative from Florida House District 42, Anna Eskamani. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It means a lot to me. I almost feel legitimate now. Oh, yeah. Well, from your favorite gator, goodbye from the swamp.